integral philosophies, theories, and practices. But whatever. So now let's go back to comparing and contrasting the works of Ken Wilber, Jean Gebser, and Killian Morgan as three good examples of what integral philosophies and theories can be and why. So we saw last time that we could approach this endeavor of making sense of the broad spectrum of ideas and philosophers or thinkers or practitioners that could be grouped into a big set called integral. So we saw that we could approach it using tools from the rational or mental structure of consciousness, which is what I was doing when I was dissecting the entire idea through words, through various causation of the presence of such or such content into the work, like deconstructing the ideas, where they came from, where in history, where in space. The same works could be approached in a completely different way via tools from the mythic consciousness structure or from the magic consciousness structure or the archaic. And the content would look nothing alike. And even the ideas behind, say, as a myth, what can the integral striving be? Striving to reconcile, the striving to reunite, the striving to subsume all knowledge and into this akashic unity. The integral could then be broached through myths. It could be approached and dwelled into and deepened through stories, through deep analogies, through resonance with other stories, other myths, other archetypes. In the magic structure of consciousness, the word itself, the sound and the resonating vibration emitted from the word and the idea it contains could be thought of as a power in itself, say a god, the integral god. In the same way some authors had made the cancel god. So the integral god, or more, God would stray more into the mythical. So maybe the integral spirit would be more akin to the idea. So integral kami is a power that is interacting with other powers that are somehow individualized or coalescing, they're getting their aggregated forms of consciousness, or concentrated. If you picture the archaic as a sort of distributed and undifferentiated level of consciousness, that could be summarized as the groundless ground of all things, or as the infinite and definite, as I tend to call it myself, or as chaos, void, emptiness, or the unified field of information. So if we picture it like this, then the existence is the concretion, the aggregation or concentration of some of these aspects of the distributed consciousness or distributed information, concentrating into dots, into units. These units are still very much flowing or blended into the ocean of consciousness. They differentiate themselves by a bludgeoning concentration of feeling and a bludgeoning concentration of information. Yet there is no divide, and these powers are very much part of the overall nature of things. The magical in the story depicted by Gebser, for instance, is the further concentration of removing the individual consciousness or group consciousness first from the overall distributed field of information. This global unity, the mythical or mythic structure of consciousness, is increasing this coalescence of this concretion or aggregation, concentration of matter, energy, information, power into individual units that extract themselves slowly from first the overall unity, then the unity of nature, then the unity of group, culture, society, and then more and more and more as time goes on. More as not as time goes on, but as revolutions in the structure of consciousness keep happening or keep being experienced or tried. So exploring pretty much any subject nowadays, most of the time we'll go directly through the lens of the rational, the mental structure of consciousness. So this will seem so obvious first because very few people read anything about integral approaches, integral theories. Few people, relatively speaking, read people like Ken Wilber, even less read the original sources like Gebser. And still maybe less even, although now due to the change in medias, maybe more people, or less, who knows, heard about Kellan Morgan on his YouTube channel. So when I'm exploring or contrasting Wilber, Gebser, and Kellan Morgan, what I use mostly are mental tools, rational tools. If I was to try to use the mythic, I would need to weave a storyline, a myth, a tale, and use their similarities and contrast as resonant chords with everlasting polarities, everlasting stories, everlasting tensions into the history of ideas, or the history of mankind. So since this would be a lot of work, I'll keep going for now with the mental tools of contrast. But we need to be aware that we are using tools that are still relative to a way of perceiving the world, and that this way of being into the world is not something that has stayed the same, although the hardware of mankind has barely changed over the last few thousand centuries in the process of hominization, has not expanded very widely the processing power of humans in the last score of millennia. Yet still this seeming similarity or seeming stability can obscure the fact that the softwares that are used to activate this hardware and the programs or sub-programs or parts of the hardware that are mobilized changed vastly and immensely. Even if we take humanity as like Homo sapiens as a very peculiar type of experiment of symbiosis with external material that are used as extension and externalization of function through the use of tools and like physical tools and mental tools that we can call techniques or systems or methods. If we include that, then it could be said that the overall change in hardware for computation and treatment of information has not changed a lot biologically, but that it has changed immensely technologically. We have sort of switched somehow species-wise. We have switched from biological changes to material changes through the wide use of techniques. So now let's get back to Kellan Morgan, Jean Gebser, and Ken Wilber. So in chronological order, it would be Jean Gebser, the source, Ken Wilber, explicitation of it much later than Kellan. I started to dwell or to explore some of the similarities and contrast between Ken Wilber's work and Kellan Morgan's work. Now I'll get back to the origin and contrast Wilber's work and Gebser's. I won't go in depth due to the scope that would be covered, but to give a few examples of these various tastes of integral works. We'll see first that Jean Gebser was a philologist, so a specialist of languages. He was a traveler. He moved widely worldwide in in contexts that were quite different from what's found nowadays. In the mondialized era, many people have moved, few people have traveled. Many people moved for tourism, and few people expose themselves to the unknown of a new culture, a new country, new nature. So, being myself a traveler, and being myself due to this quite involved in languages at times, although not at all in the same precise and not theoretical but in-depth way as Gebser was. My approach to languages was much more like everyday practical need and use. So still I share with Gebser more things maybe than I share with Wilber. So there are things that I can sort of see in Gebser's work, and things that I feel lacking wouldn't be the word, because I'm not expecting everybody to be a crazy walking traveler or whatnot, but it's so. Lately, I was reading Gebser and Wilber in parallel. The last book by Wilber and the other Present Origin. So, first thing that appears directly is the intricacy of Gebser's language, the careful choice of every word, and the artistic weaving of the sentences, and then of chapters and the overall book. So in much the same way I depicted the strong emphasis on the Formscapes channel by Kellen Morgan, emphasis on beautification, the integration of the beautiful into deep work of philosophy and thinking. So in much the same way it is found on the YouTube channel, it is found at an even greater level into the work of Gebser. The language of Gebser is in itself a work of artistry, and this work of artistry is in its own way striving towards the integral. So it's a sort of an integral language. So I'll go back to what it could mean. First, the integral aspect is found into the weaving together of subjects that would be now mostly approached only by specialists of the arts, specialists of language, specialists of culture. So many broken and fragmented specialties are woven together by Gebser. Natural sciences, less so in the ever-present origin, because he wrote prior work which broached mostly on it. Although the work is not very easy to find. But so Gebser's words are very carefully weighted and pondered. And they are pondered for clarity, diaphanous, like transparency. So the words are trying to convey as clearly but as precisely as possible the depth and the core of the idea. And the Gebser makes big efforts to try to avoid any pitfall, any massive misunderstanding or simplification or caricature of the ideas he's bringing in due to poor use of words. So for instance, when you read Gebser and Wilber pretty much alternating, it's very, very obvious that the quality of the language is not the same. The quality does not mean that Wilber is writing poorly. It's that the language used by Wilber is obviously maybe carefully weighted or carefully crafted, but for a very, very different purpose. Wilber is publicizing, is spreading the word, or is making something widely accessible. So Wilber is in some way a mass production or mass distribution of integral ideas, which most likely is what part of what say deep philosophers like Killen Morgan would criticize in his work. Still, to my mind, if you take some sort of integral approach, it's obvious that not all people can dive into the depth, and it would be very hard to have one writer after another, one thinker or practitioner after another, being able to go deeper and deeper and deeper and deeper. Especially since the experience would be so unique and so different from the rest of the culture that it would be nigh useless to try to translate it and communicate it via writings. So Gebser's work is pioneer work. He's living at the time when he sees this new structure of consciousness appear. It's not that it didn't exist prior, but it is appearing at the surface of a culture in ways that are made obvious by the arts, for instance. So Gebser depicts the work of arts of people like Picasso or Braque, that he knew at least Picasso, and he describes some of the works or some periods of the work of Picasso as a coalescence of the integral structure of consciousness, the integration of time, or the appropriation of time by the individual consciousness. In the same way the mythic era was, or the rational era was the appropriation of space via perspective. So, what do I mean by the importance of a different wording of ideas by Wilber and Gebser? So to take just one example, Gebser goes to great length describing why he chose the word structure other words that could have been used to convey more or less the same idea. So why he chose it rather than levels, for instance, or stages. And a very, very strong argument made by Gebser is that first, stages, for instance, would give the impression that these structures of consciousness are explored individually and collectively, maybe in development or in evolution. And when they're passed, when a new structure, a more complex or more modern structure emerges, then they're left behind. In the same way you would go on a trip, take a stop at a given stage, given step, given resting place, enjoy it for a bit and move on and reach the next one. You do not carry with you the preceding places you've been to, except internally. You do carry with you the various strata of cells or of differentiation of tissues that were developed during your continuous development since conception. So these layers continuously exist, although their relative importances and the shapes and whatnot changed over time. Their relationships changed also. So it could be thought that Gebser would use strata, the way I use quite often when I use an analogy of geology to depict how the landscapes can make one strata or one stratum that has been buried or that has turned into an unconscious or unappearing invisible structure, how it can emerge in the valleys in some landscapes where colliding mountains make strata move up or whatnot. So this is, by analogy, I can use something like this I can use the word strata because I use the geological analogy or the geomorphological analogy. Yet, Wilber is well aware of things like this, but he doesn't use the word stratum either. And it is explicitly due to the careful choice of every detail in his work. To Gebser, the integral structure is the absorption of time. The works of Picasso where you see the same character and blended into the same figures would be different profiles. So you would see the character from the front, then the side. You could see the character in different circumstances. You could even see it at different ages, for instance. So this, for Gebser, was a way of incarnating this idea of the integral as the appropriation of all these aspects of time. The integral, in some way, is, as I depicted it, can be thought as a way of taking the past and making sense of it, like by mapping it into a gigantic meta theory, meta framework, meta cartography, where things can be seen as much as possible in their context, felt as still living and still incarnating now, while also presenting the movements, constant evolution, constant change that's happening. So Gebser doesn't use stratum because of the relationship to space. That's a word that he uses a few times, or that is found elsewhere in relation to time in Bergson, for instance. So it's prior. Bergson wrote about the specialization of time. Time being turned into a dimension of space, or a similarity drawn between space and time. So time being felt as a line on which you could travel, and made of self-similar units that could be added once to the other, and create, by adding all the years, all the days, all the seconds, you could completely map out or summarize time. So this, to Bergson, was a quite deep, not even theoretical or philosophical mistake, but a mistake of experience, a confusion of experience with a theory, something that Whitehead would have called misplaced concreteness. We create concept and give it such density of thinking, density of attention, that it becomes a being on its own. So for Gebser, there is a very, very big difference in the apprehension of the world that one gets through the development of the integral structure over the course of the 20th century, and the perspectival era that preceded, and the unperspectival era that you'd find prior to that. Due to this point, and due to the fact that it does not consider, explicitly says that considering one structure of consciousness as superior or better or more refined would be a misunderstanding of his ideas. And this you could find in some older work by Wilber. So when Wilber was massively influenced by Gebser or Rubindo and many others, and then he studied widely across fields to find instantiations of the stages of development, and then he tied it together with the ideas of structures of development by Gebser. But in doing so, there's always a danger there. When you draw analogies between things, you find the common in between the difference. It is always sort of a density, And when I mean density, density is depiction or measure of relative quantity of fullness to emptiness. The less emptiness at given scale compared to fullness, the more dense something is. Now, if we take Gebser's approach, the structures cannot be tied or compared to stages of development, to regular unfolding of biological structures that unfold in a predictive and fairly regular way that can be identified as a pattern. When we go deeper into the story of societies has been mapped this way from Darwin's time on into the movement that's called now social Darwinism. Oftentimes it's to judge various thinkers associated with it, although once again, if you actually read some of the contents of these thinkers, the judgments are meaningless. These people live, yet they do not live maybe in a completely different structure of consciousness, but they live in a very, very different society, very different history, a very different field of stories and narratives and information. So, judging them because some of the things they say are shocking to us, it's anybody's choice, but if it's done collectively, then it goes adrift very fast. It's very easy to erect tribunals for the past, and we can do that for any past and for everybody. We could judge anyone and find, by our own standards of value, find the various proofs and arguments showing that they are actually worthless, criminal, monsters, and so on. The past is a massive bloodshed, massacre, or whatnot. At the same time, the past is filled with beauty, with humanity, with inhumanity too, in the same proportion, nearly. So the perception is based on a baseline. Once you've established a baseline of comfort, security, or feeling that you have bubbles of protection around you that guarantee what may or may not happen to you, it is very easy to get the feeling that these bubbles exist everywhere and existed at all times. When you travel, especially if you travel rough and if you used to travel, say, poor countries, India, the backwaters of India, whatnot, some 20, 30 years ago, you would get a very, very different experience. Even now, the bubbles of security, the bubbles of rights and whatnot that we imagine as acquisitions of social evolution or political evolution, they are being pierced so fast. They're disappearing nearly as fast as they disappear when you are on a trip to India, where your proxemic bubbles are very fast redefined, where your idea of what can be safety changes very fast too. So now, modern era, the new mythic structures recombine with the irrational, the ending of the default rational consciousness structure. This is bringing a time of confusion, where all that was felt as acquired in the previous historical period is now being dissolved so fast that it seemed as though these seemingly deep and long-lasting structures of the past never existed. Rights, justice, they were at all times in many ways a dream made true, partly, and massive hypocrisy on the other side. But still, they, like when they will have completely disappeared, it's very likely that we will see even critics of them, amongst which I would count myself. We will still see some of the positive aspects, the things they had to bring. If we lose them entirely, we will have lost something valuable. Maybe less so than if we lose the entire fabric of complex life and the working of oceans and whatnot. At least to my taste, I would, if I had the choice, I would keep these and drop the intricacies of human social life. Still, this is a personal choice, and this is personal taste. It's not based on anything real or absolute. These experiences, these sociological evolutions, they have a value. Much the same way something that's deeply criticized now, like wokeism, in all the blur of the meaning assigned to the word. If you go back to the roots, if you go back to the core before the expression, before maybe the poor rendition or poor expression of the idea into the world, sometimes there's value in it. There's actually something very that appeared because it was absolutely necessary for the ongoing survival of society. The awareness of the status of the victim, the awareness of what is felt where you're on the losing side, when you're crushed, when your culture, society, your personality is, and your world is destroyed in front of you. Without this awareness, the massive mega machine of the rational consciousness structure, so this one world, one economy, one dominant idea, one narrative of science dominating all, one type of society. So this would turn into a monstrous monopoly of beingness, an impoverishment and homogenization of life that would be fatal to it. This spreading of civilization, of culture, science, medicine, Christianity, morality, and so on. So Western values, democracy, all you want, were at the same time the spreading of evolutive creations, creations that carried things that had not been widely experienced prior to it. So say Christianity carries a sensitivity to the suffering of the weak that is seldom found before. You find it in Buddhism, but it's found in Buddhism. It's found as something that should be extracted from life, the suffering. So pain being appropriated and turning into suffering. Buddhism is an attempt at freeing beings from suffering at first. And Christianity is not an attempt at freeing people from suffering. It is an attempt at making spiritual sense and giving spiritual value to the incarnated life and its path of everyday sort of mundane or common sufferings. Being crucified by the Roman occupant at the time of Christ was not something so rare and so uncommon. You had massive revolts against the Roman rules, and they had been mostly wiped out. So the depth of meaning of Christianity is not to be despised. It brought something, it was appropriated and it was welcomed in many places due to what it gave the poor, what it gave the peasant class, what it gave the oppressed classes. So same, you'd find some core depth into Marxism, into pretty much everything, and now expressed in what Gebser would call deficient mode, which could be said to be an excess or a shortage of something in both quantity, quality, or pertinence at the time, appropriation. So in this and lost my train of thought. Well, that will be it for now.